In the dark, damp underbelly of Mars, where the air smells like recycled socks and every surface has a fine layer of dust that's more like talcum powder if talcum powder were aggressively trying to kill you, Tycho Voron was having what could only be described as a very bad day. Of course, in the grand scheme of things, every day was a bad day on Mars, but today took the cake and ate it too. "You ever get the feeling," Tycho said, his voice echoing off the metallic walls, "that life is just one big cosmic joke and we're the punchline?" "Only every damn minute," replied Jax Harlan, his trusted compatriot and professional cynic. Jax was leaning against a console that had seen better centuries, picking his teeth with a shard of metal that looked suspiciously alien. "But hey, at least we're not the ones running this circus." "Not yet," Tycho muttered, glancing at the flickering holo screen that displayed the colony's dwindling resources. Days like these, Tycho wished he'd taken up gardening instead of engineering. How much trouble could begonias cause? The colony, affectionately dubbed Rust Bucket by its inhabitants, was a marvel of human ingenuity and desperation. Built beneath the surface to avoid the unfriendly Martian weather that could flay skin off bones faster than a bureaucrat denying health claims, Rust Bucket was home to about 1,000 hardy souls who all shared one thing in common: they were stuck. And now they were in deep trouble, deeper than usual even. "You see this?" Tycho pointed at a red dot on the screen that pulsed ominously, like the universe's worst heartbeat. Jack squinted, then shrugged. "Looks like a zit." "Yeah, well, it's a zit that's about to pop and spew us all into oblivion," Tycho said, rubbing the back of his neck where tension twisted like a snake. The zit, in reality, was a Vextron scout ship. Vextrons were the kind of aliens that made your average horror movie monster look like a cuddly pet. All tentacles and eyes, with a penchant for studying lesser beings. Like humans, they decided, before humans could even introduce themselves. "So, what's the plan, boss?" Jax asked, his voice heavy with the kind of sarcasm that only comes from years of disappointment. "The plan," Tycho said, stepping back from the console and crossing his arms, "is not to end up as a sideshow attraction in some intergalactic zoo." "Well, that sounds simple enough," Jax said, straightening up. "Just tell them no. I'm sure they'll respect our boundaries and kindly fuck off." Tycho chuckled, a sound devoid of any real humor. Yeah, if only. The Vextrons had shown up out of nowhere, as if the universe didn't already have enough problems. They'd captured a few hapless colonists already, whisking them away to who knew where. But Tycho, ever the optimist, figured he'd at least try to get in touch with their alien visitors before they decided that the rest of the colony would make a nice addition to their collection. He tapped a few buttons, sending a garbled transmission into the void. "This is Tycho Voron of the Rust Bucket Colony. We'd appreciate it if you'd kindly leave us the hell alone." "Very diplomatic," Jax noted, folding his arms. "I've always had a way with words," Tycho replied as the screen crackled back at him with an unintelligible stream of gibberish that sounded like a cat gargling marbles. "That's either an acknowledgement or an insult," Jax said, tilting his head. "Hard to tell with these guys." "Let's assume it's the latter," Tycho said, sighing. "Besides, I've got a feeling they're not here for the conversation. They're here for something else." And that something else, Tycho realized, was Earth's climate. The Vextrons, those tentacled bastards, wanted to study Earth's weather patterns so they could master it, control it. Maybe even weaponize it. "So they want to play God, huh?" Jax asked, rapping his knuckles against a panel. "Something like that," Tycho said. "And I say if they're gonna try and take control, the least we can do is make it difficult for them." "You've got a plan?" Jax asked, raising an eyebrow. "I've got a million plans," Tycho replied. "Most of them bad. But one might just be crazy enough to work." Jax grinned, a rare sight. "Well, let's get to it then. I didn't sign up for this just to watch some aliens play God with our planet." With that, they set off down the corridor, the metal floors clanging under their boots in a comforting rhythm. The rest of the colony was going about its usual business, blissfully unaware of the threat looming above them like a particularly judgmental cloud. It wasn't long before they reached the tech bay, a chaotic mess of wires, screens, and gadgets that Ticho called home. It was the kind of place that would give a health and safety inspector an aneurysm at 50 paces. "All right," Ticho said, rolling up his sleeves, "here's the deal. We need to figure out how to disrupt their signals. If we can jam their communications, maybe we can slow down whatever they are planning." "I'm guessing asking nicely isn't an option," Jax said, surveying the mess. "Not unless you've got a universal translator and a gift-wrapped bottle of whatever passes for champagne in this part of the galaxy," Ticho replied, rifling through a pile of circuit boards. "No, we're gonna have to get creative." "Creative how?" Jax asked, watching as Ticho yanked a particularly stubborn wire from a console. "We've got some tech here that they haven't seen yet," Ticho said, a glint in his eye. "Old military stuff mostly, but with a few tweaks, we might just be able to scramble their sensors long enough to make them think twice about sticking around." "That's a lot of mights and maybes," Jax pointed out. "Welcome to engineering," Ticho replied, grinning. "Where everything's made up and the points don't matter." They got to work, the air filled with the sound of soldering and swearing, punctuated by the occasional hiss of escaping steam. It wasn't elegant, and it sure as hell wasn't safe, but it was what they had. "You know," Jax said, wiping sweat from his brow, "if this doesn't work, we'll probably end up as alien soup." "Yeah," Ticho replied, adjusting a circuit board. "But if it does work, we'll just be back to our usual routine of slowly suffocating under a mountain of red dust." "I'll take the dust," Jax said. "At least it doesn't come with tentacles." After what felt like hours but was probably closer to just one particularly grueling one, Ticho finally stepped back from the console, wiping his hands on his already filthy overalls. "That's it," he said, exhaling. "Let's hope those alien bastards have a sense of humor, 'cause if this works, it's gonna be one hell of a punchline." Jax nodded, crossing his fingers as Ticho hit a button with the kind of trepidation usually reserved for defusing bombs or asking someone on a first date. The console hummed to life, sending a barrage of signals into space faster than a politician backpedaling on a campaign promise. "Now," Ticho said, eyes glued to the screen, "we wait." And wait they did, in a silence so tense it could have been cut with the shoddy knife Ticho always carried at his belt. The seconds ticked by with the elegance of a drunken space slug. Then the console beeped, a soft, electronic voice that was as close to music as anything got in Rust Bucket. "We've got something," Ticho said, his heart pounding out a rhythm that could have powered the colony for a week. On the screen, the red dot that was the Vextron ship flickered, vanished, then reappeared, its trajectory veering off course like a drunk uncle at a wedding. "They're leaving," Jax breathed, a grin splitting his face. "Looks like," Ticho said, not trusting himself to hope just yet. And just like that, the Vextrons were gone, their ship shrinking into the vastness of space until it was nothing more than a speck of dust in the universe's eye. "Well," Ticho said, clapping Jax on the back, "I'd call that a success." "For now," Jax replied, the eternal pessimist. "But you know they'll be back." "Yeah," Ticho said, gazing at the empty void outside. "But next time we'll be ready. Or at least, as ready as anyone could be when your neighbors have tentacles and a worrying interest in meteorology." "Hey, Ticho," Jax said, as they made their way back down the corridor. "If this engineering thing doesn't work out, you ever think about stand-up comedy?" Ticho snorted. "Only if the audience is armed." And with that, they returned to the chaotic mess of a colony they called home, ready to face whatever fresh hell the universe decided to throw their way next. The Rust Bucket was all that stood between humanity and a new age of tentacle-based tyranny. Ticho Vorin, engineer extraordinaire, or perhaps just a glutton for punishment, sat amid the chaos of wires and screens, having just thwarted the Vextron's first attempt at turning Earth into a vacation spot for overzealous weather nerds. Yet, as any decent doomsayer would tell you, one victory doesn't make a war. "Feels like we're the butt of some cosmic joke," Ticho muttered, kicking a pile of spare parts that might have once been a toaster. Hey, Jax, remind me why we're the ones saving the planet again. Same reason I keep coming back to this dump, Jax replied, lounging against a console like he hadn't a care in the universe. Masochism. And the free drinks. Ticho snorted, the kind of sound that would have been a laugh if it wasn't so damn close to a sob. Free drinks. Right. I'll buy the first round when we get out of this mess. You mean if, Jax corrected, tapping a finger against his head. You got a plan B, or are we just winging this and hoping the universe doesn't notice? Sort of a plan A-, Ticho said, standing and stretching. His joints popped like distant gunfire. I need to look into this alien zoo thing. If there's a chance we can exploit their misunderstanding of Earth's weather, we've got to take it. You sure you're not just hoping to find out what they feed their exhibits? Jax grinned, the kind of grin that never reached his eyes. Wouldn't say no to a good alien steak, Ticho admitted, already heading for the exit. But first, let's see what we're working with. The walk to the alien zoo, or what passed for one, was a trek through the belly of the rust bucket. Ticho and Jax ambled down corridors lit by flickering lights that seemed hell-bent on providing just enough illumination to trip over. Along the way, they passed groups of colonists engaged in the usual Martian activities, arguing about ration allocations, gambling over the next cockroach race, and generally pretending they weren't living on the edge of a red-tinted apocalypse. Hey, look on the bright side, Jax said, sidestepping a puddle that was probably just water. Probably. At least we're not stuck in some vanilla office job back on Earth. True, Ticho conceded. But at least in an office, our biggest worry would be a paper cut, not an alien probe. Semantics, Jax replied with a shrug. Finally, they reached a nondescript hatch labeled with a sign that had long since given up advertising whatever this place was supposed to be. Ticho punched in a code that he was half sure he remembered, and the door slid open with a reluctant hiss, like it was doing them a favor. Inside, the room was a mess of cages and tanks, each containing something that was either alive, dead, or in the process of deciding which was preferable. A few unfortunate humans were scattered among the exhibits, their expressions a cocktail of boredom and existential dread. "Welcome to the freak show," Ticho said, raising an eyebrow at a particularly disgruntled-looking man pacing in a cage. "And here I thought Martian entertainment was dead." Ticho Vorin, a voice cut through the air like a knife, sharp, precise, and just a little bit dangerous. Just the man I was hoping to see. Ticho turned to find a woman leaning against the bars of a nearby cage. She had the kind of face that'd look right at home on a wanted poster, all sharp angles and eyes that missed nothing. Lyra Kells, the colony's resident strategist and general pain in the ass. Though, to be fair, pain was a compliment in this place. "Lyra," Ticho greeted, adopting a casual posture that said he wasn't worried even if he was. "Didn't expect to see you here. Thought you were busy plotting our next great escape. Plans change," Lyra replied, her lips curling into a smirk. "And here I am stuck in a zoo. Ironic, isn't it? Like a fly in a spider's web," Ticho said, "if the fly also happened to know how to build webs. And the spider was on vacation," Jax added helpfully. A chuckle from the far side of the room drew their attention to a man hunched over a tank filled with what looked like a cross between a jellyfish and an overcooked lasagna. Dr. Emmett Tarsa, the colony's biologist and purveyor of questionable life choices. "Studying the local cuisine, Doc?" Ticho asked, nodding toward the tank. Tarsa straightened, peering at them over a pair of glasses that looked like they'd been repurposed from a satellite dish. "Ticho, Jax, good to see you both. I hear you've been busy playing hide and seek with our tentacled friends." "You make it sound so wholesome," Jax said, crossing his arms. "More like desperately avoiding becoming their next science project," Ticho clarified. "But yeah, we've been keeping busy." "Well, if you're here to talk shop, you've come to the right place," Tarsa said, gesturing to the collection of creatures. "The Vextrons have been struggling to figure out Earth's weather patterns. Turns out, chaos isn't their strong suit." "Who'd have thought?" Ticho said, stepping closer to inspect a cage containing a particularly disgruntled pigeon. "Any chance we can use that to our advantage?" "That's the idea," Lyra said, her voice low but urgent. "If we can convince them Earth's weather is too unpredictable to control, maybe they'll decide it's not worth the trouble." "And how do we do that?" Jax asked skeptically. "Hope for a tornado and a blizzard to hit at the same time." "Something like that," Tarsa said. "But we've got to make it look intentional. Like Earth is actively resisting their attempts." "Great," Ticho said, rubbing his chin. "So what? We dress up like weather gods and do a little dance?" Lyra rolled her eyes. "More like use their own tech against them. They've got weather manipulation equipment on their ship. If we can get access to it, we might be able to cause enough chaos to make them rethink their vacation plans." "Weather manipulation tech," Jax said, eyebrows shooting up. "Didn't realize we were dealing with alien meteorologists." "They've got a thing for controlling environments," Tarsa explained. "But Earth's got a mind of its own. It's like trying to herd cats with a water gun." "Right," Ticho said, nodding. "So we break in, hijack their systems, and make it look like Earth's giving them the finger. Simple. Simple as juggling chainsaws," Lyra said dryly. "But it's the best shot we've got." Ticho looked around at the makeshift team of misfits, each one as unlikely a hero as the next. Yet, given the choice between this ragtag group and a boardroom full of bureaucrats, he knew where he'd put his money. "All right," Ticho said, clapping his hands together. "Let's get to work. We need to figure out how to get on that ship without becoming alien sushi." The plan was as risky as it was insane, which, in Ticho's experience, meant it had a decent chance of succeeding. They spent the next few hours huddled around a makeshift map of the Vextron ship, Tarsa pointing out weak spots and access points, while Lyra scribbled notes with the fervor of someone who thrived on a challenge. "Think of it like a heist," Lyra said, sweeping her hand over the map. "We get in, cause some chaos, and get out before they know what hit them." "Sounds like my last relationship," Jax quipped, earning a smirk from Ticho. "Doesn't help that we're going in blind," Tarsa added, tapping a finger on the spot where they believed the weather controls were located. "We'll need to improvise once we're inside." "We do that, and maybe they'll decide Earth's more trouble than it's worth," Ticho said. "Or they decide to just blow it up and call it a day," Jax said, ever the pessimist. "Only one way to find out," Lyra said, sliding a knife into her boot with the kind of ease that suggested she'd done this sort of thing before. The team was as ready as they'd ever be, which wasn't saying much, but in the rust bucket, you took what you could get. They filed out of the zoo, their footsteps echoing in the empty corridors like the beats of a particularly grim march. "Hey, Ticho," Jax said as they neared the airlock that would lead them into the void and, hopefully, onto the Vextron ship. "Think there's a chance we might actually pull this off?" Ticho glanced at the ragtag team, then at the distant stars beyond the ship's hull. "If we don't, at least we'll go out with a bang," Jax snorted. "I'll drink to that." As they prepared for the most reckless, absurd mission of their lives, Ticho couldn't help but think that maybe, just maybe, a little chaos was exactly what the universe needed. And if it wasn't, well, at least they'd give it one hell of a show. The airlock loomed like the universe's least inviting invitation, humming ominously as Ticho, Jax, Lyra, and Tarsa gathered around it. Each of them was armed with a mix of grim determination and the kind of reckless optimism that only surfaced when you'd hit rock bottom and started digging. "So, we just walk into the belly of the beast and hope it doesn't chew us up and spit us out?" Jax asked, his voice dripping with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for dental surgeries. "Essentially," Ticho replied, strapping a modified toolkit to his belt. The tools were half jury-rigged alien tech, half whatever he could scrounge from the rust bucket's maintenance bay. If they exploded, at least they'd go out with style. "Great," Jax sighed, checking his sidearm, which was about as reliable as his last girlfriend. "I always wanted to be that guy who gets sucked into space because someone forgot to latch the door." "At least you'll have a nice view," Lyra quipped, peering at the airlock controls like they might sprout fangs at any moment. Now let's get on with it before I start regretting my life choices. The airlock cycled open with a groan, revealing the cold, unforgiving void beyond. The Vextron ship loomed in the distance, a hulking mass that looked like it had been designed by someone with a vendetta against symmetrical architecture. Its surface was covered in pulsing lights and strange appendages that twisted through the vacuum like the tentacles of some cosmic leviathan. "Think they take reservations," Tarsa muttered, adjusting his glasses with the kind of precision that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. "I'm not sure they're ready for a party this rowdy." Titcho glanced at the biologist, amused. "I'm sure they'll love the surprise." Always nice to meet new friends, especially when they're not trying to dissect you. The team tethered themselves to a makeshift wire, stepping into the vacuum with the grace of a drunk acrobat. Titcho felt the weightlessness tug at him, a reminder that one slip could send them adrift, yet the thought was oddly freeing. If they did drift off, at least it'd be an adventure. They reached the Vextron cruiser without incident, unless you counted Jax's periodic complaints about the temperature as incidents. The ship's hull was a jagged expanse of metal and strange organic material, a testament to the Vextron's knack for combining the worst parts of biology and engineering. "Here's our entrance," Lyra announced, pointing to a service hatch that looked like it had seen better days. Titcho wondered if it was meant for maintenance or if they'd just found an intergalactic trash chute. Either way, it'd do. They slipped inside, the transition from the silence of space to the faint hum of alien machinery disorienting. The corridor was dimly lit, the walls lined with a strange, pulsing material that seemed to breathe as they passed. "Homie," Jax remarked, his voice echoing in the cramped space. "Bet their decorating budget went entirely on mood lighting." "Keep your eyes open," Titcho advised, glancing at the map Tarsa had cobbled together. It was little more than a series of guesses and hearsay, but it was the best they had. "We're heading for the central control room. Hopefully it'll have everything we need to wreak a little havoc." "By hopefully you mean maybe," Lyra corrected, her eyes scanning the corridor for any sign of movement. "We're going in blind and you know it." "Blind's my favorite way to go," Titcho shot back. "Keeps things interesting." Their plan hinged on the assumption that the Vextrons were as curious as they were invasive. If they could draw enough attention to their antics, maybe the aliens would pull back on their invasion plans long enough for the humans to regroup, or, at the very least, survive another day. They reached a junction and Titcho gestured for silence. Voices, low and guttural, echoed from a corridor to their left. Vextrons, if he had to guess, though he'd yet to decipher their language beyond kill and mutilate, which seemed to crop up with alarming frequency. "Time for Plan A-," Titcho whispered, nodding toward a side passage. "We'll take the scenic route." "Long as it doesn't involve alien hospitality," Jax muttered, following the others into the shadows. They navigated through the bowels of the ship, avoiding patrols and hoping that whatever passed for cameras on this vessel were as subpar as the rest of the construction. Finally, they reached their destination, a door marked with strange glyphs that, to Titcho, looked like a toddler's first attempt at finger painting. "This it?" Lyra asked, skepticism heavy in her voice. "Only one way to find out," Titcho replied, tapping a series of buttons on the panel beside the door. The controls sparked dangerously, but the door slid open, revealing a room crowded with consoles and displays that blinked with alien data. Tarsa wasted no time, moving to the nearest terminal with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for kids in candy stores. "Let's see what we can do with this." The biologist's hands flew over the controls, and Titcho watched as the room's displays flickered, the alien script replaced by a chaotic cascade of Earth weather patterns. Hurricanes clashed with tornadoes and blizzards swept through deserts, a symphony of chaos. "This should keep them busy," Tarsa said, a hint of pride in his voice. "Nice work, Doc," Titcho said, patting him on the back. "Think we can do more than just confuse them." Lyra was already at another console, her fingers moving with the precision of a surgeon. If we can overload their systems, we might be able to cause some real damage. As they worked, alarms blared through the ship, a sound like a discordant choir of banshees. The team exchanged a glance, the kind that spoke volumes. They'd been noticed. "Time to make ourselves scarce," Ticho said, grabbing his tools. "Jax, lead us out." "With pleasure," Jax replied, already moving toward the exit. They retraced their steps through the ship, the sounds of chaos following them like an overeager dog. Vextrons shouted in their guttural tongue, and the ship shuddered as if caught in the throes of an internal storm. Reaching the airlock felt like the home stretch of a marathon where the finish line was on fire. They clambered through, sealing the hatch behind them and releasing the tether. The Vextron ship was a mess, its exterior blinking with lights as systems failed and rebooted in a frenzy. The chaos they'd sown was working, at least for the moment. "Think they'll back off now?" Jax asked as they drifted back to the rust bucket, the safety of its worn hull a welcome sight. "Either that or they'll come back with friends," Ticho replied, his voice heavy with cynicism. "But we bought ourselves some time, and in this game time's as good as gold." "Here's hoping they spend it arguing over whose fault this is," Lyra said, her eyes fixed on the Vextron cruiser as it floundered in orbit. They docked with the rust bucket, the airlock sealing behind them with a reassuring thud. It wasn't much, but it was home, and for now it was safe. As they stepped back into the ship's familiar corridors, Ticho couldn't help but reflect on the absurdity of it all. They were a ragtag band of misfits holding back a technologically superior alien invasion with nothing but wit and duct tape. "Think we'll get a medal for this?" Jax asked, his tone light but his eyes serious. "More like a bill for property damage," Ticho replied, clapping him on the shoulder. "But hey, at least it'll be a hell of a story." They made their way to the central hub, where the colony's leaders would no doubt be waiting for a report. The holo screen flickered with updates, the colony's meager resources stretched thinner than ever. "Think they'll give us a hero's welcome?" Tarsa wondered aloud, adjusting his glasses as they approached the control room. "Only if heroes are expected to fix the mess they made," Lyra said dryly, running a hand through her hair. They entered the control room to find a crowd of anxious faces. The colony's leaders were huddled around the holo screen, their expressions a mix of hope and desperation. Ticho, Jax, Lyra, Tarsa. The head engineer greeted them, relief evident in his voice. "I hear you've been busy." "You could say that," Ticho replied, crossing his arms. "We managed to throw a wrench in the Vextron's plans, bought us some time at least." "Time's good," the engineer said, nodding. "Time's what we need." "But it's not a solution," Lyra interjected, her voice firm. "We can't keep doing this hoping for a miracle." "Agreed," Ticho said. "But it's all we've got for now." The room fell silent, each person lost in their own thoughts. The rust bucket was far from a paradise, but it was their last bastion against the encroaching darkness. "Well, if we're going down," Jax said, breaking the tension with a wry grin, "let's make sure we go down fighting." "Here, here," Ticho agreed, clinking the edge of his toolkit with an imaginary glass. "To chaos, confusion, and the occasional victory." As the team settled in, they knew the battle was far from over. But they'd faced impossible odds before, and somehow they'd always managed to survive. The Vextrons might be relentless, but they just learned a valuable lesson. Never underestimate the power of human ingenuity, especially when it was pissed off and had nothing left to lose. The mess hall of the rust bucket smelled like a combination of burnt coffee and desperation. Ticho Vorin sat at a table, his fingers drumming on the metal surface like a musician, practicing a funeral march. Across from him, Jax Harlan was dismantling his sidearm with the diligence of a man attempting to find Waldo in a sea of stripes. "You know, if you had a more reliable gun, you wouldn't need to perform surgery on it every 5 minutes, Ticho observed, leaning back in his chair. Jack snorted, his eyes never leaving the disassembled pieces. "And if you had a better plan, we might not be living on a ship that's one malfunction away from becoming humanity's last barbecue," Ticho smirked. "Touché." But let's not pretend your tinkering is going to save us when the Vextrons finally kick down our door. And here I thought hope was the breakfast of champions, Jax replied, slotting the sidearm back together with a click. Their banter was interrupted by Lyra, who slid into the seat next to Titcho with the grace of a cat that just realized it's been turned into a meme. "Guess what, gents," she announced, her voice laden with the kind of faux excitement only a seasoned pessimist could muster. "The Vextrons are speeding up their plans to invade Earth." Titcho raised an eyebrow. "And here I thought I was the only one who liked to rush into things unprepared." "Apparently, they're tired of playing cat and mouse with us," Lyra continued, her fingers tapping on the table. "They've decided to skip the foreplay and go straight for the jugular." "Well, that's just rude," Jax said dryly. "I didn't even get them flowers." Titcho nodded, his mind already whirring with the possibilities. "We need to find a way to hit them where it hurts." "Funny you should mention that," Lyra said, a glint in her eye that suggested she'd stumbled upon something interesting. "Turns out the alien zoo has a weakness in their containment fields. An opportunity to unleash chaos," Titcho mused, a grin spreading across his face. "Exactly the kind of card we need to play. With any luck, it'll be enough to buy us more time," Lyra added. "Or at least give them something else to worry about besides wiping us out." Jax leaned back, stretching his arms above his head. "So, what's the plan?" "Let the alien equivalent of a pride of lions loose and hope for the best." "Pretty much," Titcho said with a shrug. "Let's see if we can convince them that they've bitten off more than they can chew." The three of them spent the next few hours poring over the schematics and data Lyra had managed to cobble together. It was a patchwork of half-baked theories and best guesses, but it was all they had. The zoo's containment fields were designed to keep the intergalactic menagerie in check, but they also had a nasty habit of shorting out when subjected to stress. "Kind of like me when I run out of coffee," Jax quipped, earning a snort from Lyra. "Or like this ship when asked to do anything more strenuous than float in space," Titcho added. With a plan in mind, they gathered their gear and headed for the docking bay, where Tarsa was already waiting with the Rust Bucket's version of a getaway vehicle, a small shuttle that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts and duct tape. "Ready to play zookeeper?" Tarsa asked, adjusting his glasses as he double-checked the shuttle's systems. "More like ready to play escape artist," Titcho replied. But close enough. Their journey to the alien zoo was uneventful, if you discounted Jax's running commentary on the shuttle's alarming tendency to shudder every few minutes as if it was having second thoughts about this whole space thing. "Just imagine the warranty claims on this thing," Jax muttered as they docked at the zoo's service bay. "It's probably older than any of us." The zoo itself was a sprawling complex of interconnected domes and tunnels, each housing a different species of alien life form. The creatures within shifted and moved like a living tapestry, their strange forms casting eerie shadows on the walls. "Welcome to Jurassic Planet," Lyra whispered as they made their way through the corridors. "Now with extra tentacles." Titcho stopped at a control panel, his toolkit already in hand. "Let's introduce some chaos to the equation." As his fingers danced across the controls, the lights flickered and dimmed, the containment fields fluctuating like a heart monitor on its last legs. The creatures within began to stir, their inherent curiosity piqued by the sudden change. "All right, that should do it," Titcho said, stepping back. "Now let's get out of here before they realize we're the ones responsible." They retraced their steps, the zoo's corridors alive with the sounds of alien life forms waking from their slumber. As they boarded the shuttle, Titcho couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. They'd given the Vextrons something else to focus on, something that might just tip the scales in humanity's favor. But as they flew back to the Rust Bucket, Tarsa brought up another concern. "There's one more thing," he said, tapping at his tablet. "I've been working on a biological solution to confuse their weather simulations." Jax raised an eyebrow. "Weather simulations? You mean we're fighting these guys with rain clouds and sunshine?" "Not quite," Tarsa replied, adjusting his glasses. The Vextrons rely on advanced weather simulations to plan their attacks, using them to predict the best times and places to strike. And you found a way to throw a wrench in that plan? Lyra asked, intrigued. Tarsa nodded. I've developed a biological agent that can disrupt their simulations, feeding them false data. If we can deploy it in the right place, we might be able to confuse them long enough to gain the upper hand. Ticho considered this, his mind racing with possibilities. All right, let's add it to the mix. The more chaos we can create, the better our chances. As they approached the rust bucket, the ship's worn hull looming larger with every passing moment, Ticho felt a renewed sense of determination. They were fighting a losing battle, but that didn't mean they couldn't go down swinging. The colony's leaders were waiting for them when they docked, their faces a mixture of relief and anxiety. Ticho laid out their plan, his words punctuated by the occasional cough of the rust bucket's failing ventilation system. It's risky, one of the leaders said, his voice heavy with doubt. But if it works, it could buy us the time we need to regroup, or at least delay the inevitable, Jax added with a wry grin. And who doesn't love a good delaying tactic? Ticho nodded, his expression serious. It's not a perfect solution, but it's the best we've got. The room fell silent, the weight of their situation pressing down on them like an unwelcome guest. But there was a sense of camaraderie, a shared determination that made the burden a little easier to bear. As they prepared for the next phase of their plan, Ticho couldn't help but reflect on the absurdity of it all. They were a motley crew of survivors, trying to outsmart an alien race with nothing but grit and ingenuity. But if there was one thing humanity excelled at, it was defying the odds. And as long as they had even the slightest chance, they'd fight to the bitter end. To chaos, confusion, and unlikely victories, Lyra said, raising an imaginary glass in salute. Here's to making the impossible possible, Ticho agreed, clinking his toolkit against hers. As they headed back to the shuttle, ready to unleash their latest gambit on the unsuspecting Vextrons, Ticho felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep them going. And in a universe where hope was in short supply, that was all they could ask for. The rust bucket was having one of its usual days, the kind where the air tasted like burnt coffee and the walls leaked desperation. Ticho Vorin was pacing in what passed for the ship's command center, a room that looked like it had been decorated by someone who thought irony was a design principle. There was a holo screen in the corner, flickering like it had a bad case of space epilepsy, displaying a grim reminder of their dwindling resources. Jax Harlan leaned against an ancient console, his sidearm in pieces on the floor. You know, he said, glancing up from his work, at this rate we might want to consider cannibalism. I hear engineers taste like chicken. Ticho snorted. Just make sure you clean your plate, Jax. We wouldn't want to waste any precious resources. Lyra arrived, dragging her feet with a sigh that could have blown out a nearby bulkhead. Vextrons are tightening security, she announced, slumping into a chair that protested under her weight. Adapting to our sabotage like we're playing a game of alien chess. Great, Ticho muttered. We're losing to an enemy that looks like it was designed by Picasso on a bad day. At least Picasso had some taste, Jax chimed in, fitting the last piece of his gun back together with a hopeful click. The Vextrons are more like spray paint on a highway underpass. Tarsa wandered in, looking like he'd been up all night in a data coma. I've got bad news and then I've got worse news, he said, holding up a tablet that seemed to emit despair. Which do you want first? Surprise us, Ticho replied, gesturing at the screen with his modified toolkit. The toolkit was a Frankenstein's monster of alien tech and Rustbucket's maintenance bay leftovers, about as reliable as a politician's promise. The bad news is our initial escape plan has hit a snag, Tarsa said, eyes bleary behind his glasses. The Vextrons have started using some kind of new tech to scan our shuttle routes. And the worst news? Lyra asked, rubbing her temples, exhaustion etched into her every feature. The Vextrons have figured out our little trick with the alien zoo. They've reinforced the containment fields, Tarsa explained, sinking into what passed for a chair. We're officially back to square one. Fantastic, Jack said, throwing his hands in the air. We're running out of time, resources, and I'm almost out of sarcasm. Ticho rubbed his face, feeling the stubble there like grit on sandpaper. He couldn't help but feel like the universe was using him as a cosmic dartboard. All right, folks, let's not wave the white flag just yet. It's more like a dirty dish towel at this point, Lyra pointed out. Point taken, Ticho conceded. But we've still got Tarsa's biological disruptor, and if we can find a way to deploy it, we might still have a shot at confusing their weather simulations. That's a big if, Tarsa muttered. And even bigger when you consider our current position is about as favorable as an ice cube's in hell. Just then, the ship shuddered as if it was having an existential crisis. They all paused, glancing around as if expecting the walls to start a tongue-in-cheek commentary on the situation. Is it just me, or does the rust bucket feel like it's about to give up the ghost? Jax asked, looking up from his weapon. Wouldn't be surprised, Ticho said. It's been holding itself together with spit and hope for longer than we thought. As if on cue, the holo screen flared wildly before going on a vacation, leaving them with the soft glow of emergency lights. A perfect metaphor for their current predicament. Tarsa cleared his throat. There's one thing we haven't considered. Please enlighten us, Lyra said, motioning for him to continue. A Martian storm, he replied, gesturing at his tablet. One's on the horizon according to my calculations, and it's likely to mess with their systems. It might give us the opportunity we need to test the disruptor. Ticho perked up, the glimmer of hope like a lifeline thrown at a drowning man. All right then, let's make that work. Work like a charm or work like a pile of malfunctioning junk? Jax asked, raising an eyebrow. I'd settle for somewhere in between, Ticho said. Let's get this thing prepped and then figure out how to deliver it. They set to work, each assuming tasks with the efficiency of desperation. The ship's corridors echoed with the sound of shuffling feet and muttered curses as they gathered everything they needed for the plan's next phase. As they huddled in the shuttle bay, Tarsa handed Ticho a small canister. This baby should do the trick. Just don't jostle it too much unless you want a face full of biological agent. Reassuring as ever, Ticho said, pocketing the canister with exaggerated care. The shuttle waited for them, looking as reliable as a politician's promise during campaign season. Jax climbed in first, patting the side of the craft as if it was a skittish horse. Think we'll make it back this time. If not, at least we'll go out with a bang, Lyra quipped, strapping into her seat. Besides, Ticho added, what's life without a little risk? Longer, Jax replied, strapping himself in. As the shuttle launched, they felt the familiar churn of the engines, accompanied by a symphony of ungodly noises that made everyone silently pray to the space gods for a smooth ride. Ticho, however, couldn't shake off the feeling that they were pushing their luck more than usual today. The storm was already brewing when they reached the Vextron systems. Mars's sky, often a dull, reddish haze, had transformed into a swirling maelstrom of chaos. Tarsa's calculations had been right. This storm was the real deal, and if the Vextron systems were as out of whack as they hoped, it might just be their ticket to messing with the enemy's plans. Ticho glanced at the others. This was their moment, a fleeting chance to turn the tide in their favor, or at least buy themselves a little more time before the universe finished what it started. All right, people, he said, voice steady. Let's unleash some chaos. Jax grinned, eyes glinting with that reckless spark he got whenever they were about to do something incredibly stupid. Here's to screwing with the aliens' heads. They moved quickly, every moment feeling like it was borrowed against an uncertain future. Ticho deployed the disruptor, watching as the canister released its payload into the Martian atmosphere. It spread invisibly, a ghostly hand reaching out to send the Vextrons into a spiral of confusion. Now we wait, Tarsa said, his voice tense with anticipation. The shuttle hung in the sky like an awkward metaphor, silent and still, as they watched the chaos unfold below. The storm raged, battering the Vextron's ship with the kind of ferocity Mars had become known for. Lights flickered, systems sputtered, and the alien ship lurched as if trying to perform an impromptu dance routine. "Looks like it's working," Lyra said, relief threading through her words. "But for how long?" Jax asked, ever the skeptic. "Long enough," Ticho replied, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "Long enough for us to regroup and come up with something better." As they headed back to the rust bucket, the storm still raging behind them, Ticho felt that tiny flicker of hope spark again. They had managed to confuse the enemy, if only for a little while. It wasn't a victory, not yet, but it was a start. And right now, a start was more than any of them had dared hope for. Back on the rust bucket, the atmosphere was palpably tense. The leaders gathered around Ticho and his team like vultures over a fresh kill, eager for any scrap of good news. "We managed to deploy the disruptor," Ticho reported, trying to keep his voice steady. "The Martian storm helped us cover our tracks, and for now their systems are in chaos." "How long will it last?" one of the leaders asked, his voice a cocktail of skepticism and desperation. "Long enough for us to breathe," Jax replied, crossing his arms. "But we need a new plan before they recover." "And we're fresh out of brilliant ideas," Lyra added, a wry smile tugging at her lips. "Unless someone's got a miracle stashed away somewhere." Silence hung around them like a persistent fog, everyone acutely aware of the precariousness of their situation. Ticho knew they had bought themselves a little time, but it was time they had to use wisely. "We may not have a miracle," Ticho said, looking each person in the eye, "but we've got tenacity, grit, and just enough insanity to make it through." "And a hell of a lot of dumb luck," Jax added. "Don't forget the dumb luck," Ticho agreed, smirking. They dispersed, each with their own tasks, knowing that the clock was still ticking down towards an uncertain future. But for now, they had stalled the Vextrons, thrown their plans into disarray. It was a small victory, but in a universe that seemed hell-bent on their demise, any victory was worth celebrating. As Ticho leaned against the hull, watching the storm rage outside through a small viewport, he couldn't help but chuckle. They were a ragtag bunch on a ship that felt like it was held together by wishful thinking. But they were still here, still fighting. And in a universe that was as dark and hostile as the void itself, that was something. The Rust Bucket's command center buzzed with a nervous energy, like a hive of bees teetering on the edge of self-destruction. Ticho Vorin stood at the center of the storm, literally and figuratively, as the holo screen flickered back to life, displaying the Martian chaos unfolding outside. The dark humor of their situation wasn't lost on him. It was like having a front row seat at the end of days, but with worse seating arrangements. Jax Harlan, leaning against a console that was older than dirt, was putting the final touches on his notoriously unreliable sidearm. "How many times does that make?" Ticho asked, nodding at the weapon like it was a recalcitrant teenager. "More than it's worth," Jax replied, snapping the last piece into place. "But if I'm going out, I'm dragging this piece of junk with me. It's kind of like a bad marriage that way." Lyra, ever the harbinger of bad news, shuffled into the room, her exhaustion as plain as the nose on her face. "The Vextrons have decided to finally notice our little field trip. They're rolling out the red carpet, well, the alien equivalent. I'm sure it's as unwelcoming as it sounds." "You mean like those metal tentacles they keep waving at us?" Ticho asked, trying to ignore the knot forming in his stomach. "Exactly. Nothing says welcome, earthlings like a mess of metal spaghetti." Tarsa joined them, looking as chipper as a man who'd just been handed an eviction notice. "The disruptor did its job, though. Their systems are in chaos, and the alien zoo's containment fields are acting like they've got a death wish." "Finally, a stroke of luck," Jax said, though his tone suggested he was waiting for the other shoe to drop. "What's the catch?" "The Vextrons are onto us," Tarsa said. "They're not as dumb as we hoped, and now we've piqued their interest." "Great," Ticho muttered, rubbing his temples. "We've gone from being an insignificant nuisance to a significant one. At least we're moving up in the world," Lyra quipped. Yeah, next stop, getting vaporized, Ticho shot back, half grinning. They geared up, each of them donning their spacesuits like battle armor. The Martian storm was their ally but also their adversary, helpful in screwing with Vextron's systems, but equally eager to flay the skin off their bones. Their mission: breach the zoo's containment fields and sow as much chaos as possible. Ticho's mind spun with the possibilities, each fraught with danger and a side of existential dread. As they approached the airlock, he couldn't help but think that this was probably the worst idea they'd ever had, and they'd had some real doozies. The airlock, an ominous gateway to the void, loomed before them. Ticho felt its presence like a cold hand on his back, pushing him toward the unknown. He glanced at his team, each one attached to the ship with old, frayed tethers that felt more like an afterthought than a safety measure. "Ready to become alien appetizers?" Jax asked, grinning like a man who'd stepped off the deep end and found he liked the water. "Absolutely," Ticho replied, sarcasm lacing his tone. "If they want us, they better have some good dipping sauces." The airlock cycled and they stepped into the void, tethered to the rust bucket like an umbilical cord to their only hope of survival. The Vextron ship loomed ahead, a hulking monstrosity with tentacles that twitched in anticipation. If there was a perfect image for welcome wagon, this wasn't it. The Martian storm howled around them, battering their suits with tiny particles that felt like a cosmic sandblaster. It was both terrifying and exhilarating, a reminder that they were alive, for now at least. Ticho could almost hear the universe laughing at their absurdity. They reached the alien zoo, the containment fields flickering like a bad light show. Tarsa's calculations had been spot on. The fields were as stable as a politician's morals, and that was putting it kindly. "Time to make some noise," Ticho said, signaling the others to begin their disruption. The zoo was a menagerie of alien beings, each more bizarre than the last, trapped behind barriers that now shimmered with uncertainty. Ticho couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy for the creatures, caught in a war they didn't understand, much like themselves. Lyra moved quickly, her fingers dancing over her toolkit, a mix of alien tech and human ingenuity. "I've got it," she said, as the last field faltered and fell. Chaos erupted as the creatures sensed freedom. The once quiet ship turned into a cacophony of alien sounds, a symphony of madness echoing through the corridors. Ticho grinned despite himself, nothing like a little pandemonium to liven up the day. The Vextrons, alerted by the sudden outbreak, scrambled to respond. They didn't look particularly pleased, which was fine by Ticho. "Let's give them a show they won't forget," he said, leading his team deeper into the chaos. As they moved through the ship, they couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Vextrons peered out from behind control panels, their eyes glowing with a mixture of confusion and anger. Ticho knew that they were now more of a target than ever, but he couldn't help but feel a thrill at the thought of turning the tide, even if just for a moment. The zoo's chaos spread like wildfire, disabling systems and opening pathways previously locked tight. They moved with speed born of desperation, each step a gamble with fate. Every corner turned was a potential encounter with death, but they pressed on, driven by necessity and a little bit of madness. Jax, ever the cynic, couldn't resist a parting shot as they left behind a particularly frenzied scene. "I always said I'd end up in a zoo, but this wasn't quite what I had in mind." "Glad to see you're still optimistic," Lyra replied, her voice dripping with irony. "Let's just hope the Vextrons aren't in the mood for a feeding frenzy." The group made their way to what appeared to be a command center, the heart of the ship's operations. It was a risky move, but if they could disable or at least distract the Vextrons further, they'd buy the rust bucket more time to regroup. "All right," Ticho said, cracking his knuckles like he was about to perform surgery without anesthesia. "Let's see how many buttons we can press before something explodes." Famous last words, Jax muttered, but he followed Ticho's lead. their hands moving over alien consoles with the kind of reckless abandon usually reserved for gamblers in a high-stakes poker game. The room lit up with warnings and alerts, the ship's systems responding to their presence like a body attacking a virus. It was a delicate dance of sabotage and survival, each action a potential trigger for disaster. "Think we can keep this up?" Lyra asked, her fingers flying over a console like a virtuoso pianist in a particularly intense concerto. "We don't really have a choice," Ticho replied, eyeing a particularly suspicious-looking button. "At this point, we're committed. Might as well go for broke." The Vextrons were closing in, their movements becoming more coordinated as they overcame their initial confusion. Ticho knew their window of opportunity was closing fast, and it was only a matter of time before they were discovered. "Time to make an exit," Tarsa said, eyes flicking to the door as it shuddered under the weight of approaching footsteps. "Agreed," Ticho replied, signaling the team to prepare for a retreat. "Let's not overstay our welcome." They moved quickly, heading back through the chaos they'd sown, the alien zoo a maelstrom of freed creatures and panicked Vextrons. It was a beautiful mess, a testament to the power of human ingenuity and sheer bloody-mindedness. As they made their way back to the airlock, Ticho couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. They'd managed to turn the tide, if only for a moment, and in a universe that seemed determined to grind them into dust, that was no small feat. "Think they'll remember us?" Jax asked as they approached the rust bucket, their comms crackling with interference from the storm. "Oh, they'll remember us," Ticho replied, a grin tugging at his lips. "We're the little pests that won't go away." They reached the airlock, the transition from the alien ship to the rust bucket, a jarring jolt back to reality. The familiar confines of their ship were both a comfort and a reminder of just how precarious their situation remained. Back aboard the rust bucket, they were greeted by a mix of relief and anticipation. The leaders gathered once more, eager to hear the results of their mission. "We did it," Ticho said, his voice carrying the weight of exhaustion and triumph. "We breached the zoo and disrupted their systems. It should buy us some time to regroup and plan our next move." "And the Vextrons?" one of the leaders asked, his tone laced with concern. "They're aware of us now," Lyra replied, crossing her arms. "But at least we've shown them that we're not going down without a fight." The room buzzed with a renewed sense of hope, tempered by the harsh reality of their situation. They were far from safe, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like they had a fighting chance. As the gathering dispersed, Ticho found himself once again at the viewport, watching the storm outside begin to dissipate. The Vextrons weren't defeated, not by a long shot, but they'd been rattled. And in this grim, unforgiving universe, that was a victory worth savoring. "Here's to the next round of insanity," Jax said, joining him with a smirk. "May it be just as insane as this one." Ticho chuckled, shaking his head. "Here's hoping it turns out a little better." Together, they watched as the rust bucket held its course, a small, defiant speck against the vastness of space. They weren't out of the woods yet, but they'd shown they could fight back. And in a galaxy that seemed determined to snuff them out, that was something worth holding onto. The air in the rust bucket's command center was thick with tension, the kind that clings to your skin like a cheap suit. Ticho Vorin surveyed his ragtag team, a motley crew of misfits and malcontents. Their latest escapade had been a shitshow of epic proportions, but they'd emerged victorious, if only because they were still breathing. Small victories in a universe bent on their annihilation. "All right," Ticho began, rubbing the grit of exhaustion from his eyes. "We've caused one hell of a mess, so let's capitalize on it before the Vextrons regroup and try to play whack-a-human." Jax Harlan, leaning against a console that had seen better centuries, snorted. "You mean before they realize that letting loose their zoo was just the opening act?" "I've seen more organized chaos at a kindergarten recess." "Maybe, but now we have a window," Tarsa chimed in, her unflagging optimism a beacon, or perhaps an irritant in their dire circumstances. Not that Ticho would ever admit it out loud, but her positivity was as rare as it was contagious. Ticho nodded, trying not to dwell on how precarious their situation remained. Exactly. We need to send Earth's infamous weather data back to the Vextron's homeworld. It'll be like sending them a gift basket, if the basket was filled with live grenades. Ah, Earth's weather, Lyra said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. A little something to remind them why no one with a brain voluntarily vacations there. Precisely, Ticho replied, his grin as sharp as a knife's edge. Let's introduce them to the concept of a surprise blizzard in July, or maybe a hurricane or two. They won't know what hit him. The plan was simple. Hack into the Vextron's communications and flood them with enough weather data to overload their systems. It was crude, it was desperate, and it reeked of human ingenuity, just what they needed. Let's get moving before the Vextrons realize the zoo isn't just a fun little diversion, Ticho said. Jax, Lyra, you're on comms. Tarsa, you're with me. We've got a zoo to navigate. They donned their suits again, each piece locking into place with a reassuring hiss. The Martian storm outside raged on, a howling tempest that promised both liberation and obliteration in equal measure. As they stepped back into the chaos of the alien zoo, the air crackled with tension. Freed creatures roamed the corridors, their alien cries punctuating the cacophony. It was bedlam, a glorious pandemonium that served their purposes well. "Follow me," Ticho said, leading the way through the maze of disoriented aliens and malfunctioning systems. "We've got to reach the main hub before the Vextrons get their act together." Jax muttered something under his breath about leading lambs to slaughter, but he followed all the same, his sidearm at the ready. Not that the damn thing was likely to work when they needed it. Ticho hoped they wouldn't have to find out. The Martian storm was both their enemy and their ally. It scoured the outside of the ship, buffeting it with enough force to make the bulkheads groan ominously. But the storm also scrambled the Vextron's sensors, giving the team a fighting chance. They navigated the labyrinthine corridors with a mix of luck and desperate improvisation. Vextrons darted through the chaos, their movements jittery and confused. Ticho found it oddly satisfying to see the alien overlords as flustered as the rest of them. "Hey, Jax," Tarsa called, her voice cutting through the din. "You think the Vextrons have a Yelp page? Terrible service, aliens escaped, would not raid again." "Let's not stick around to find out," Jax replied, ducking as a particularly volatile creature. A massive blob of bioluminescent goo slithered past. "I'd hate to leave them a one-star review myself." They reached the command hub, a room buzzing with enough alien tech to make a NASA engineer weep with jealousy. The consoles flickered and beeped, a symphony of impending doom, perfect place to make a scene. "All right," Ticho said, setting his toolkit on a console with a thud. "Lyra, Jax, plug in and let's crash this party." Lyra moved with purpose, her fingers a blur over the alien controls. "I'm in," she said, her voice steady despite the raging chaos around them. "Uploading Earth's greatest hits now." "I'm sure they'll appreciate a little taste of our hospitality," Jax added, his hands deftly manipulating the controls. Nothing like a bit of Mother Nature's wrath to liven up their day. As the data streamed out, Ticho watched the screens flicker with confusion and alarm. The Vextron systems, already strained by the zoo's outbreak, began to falter under the onslaught of data. Warnings and alerts flashed across the displays, turning the hub into a light show of impending disaster. "They're gonna love us for this," Ticho said, unable to keep the grin from his face. "Earth's finest weather direct to their doorstep. Just hope they don't send us a bill for damages," Tarsa quipped, her eyes scanning the room for any signs of incoming threats. The Vextrons, finally cottoning on to the humans' antics, began converging on their location. Ticho knew they had precious little time before their luck ran out. "Time to go," he said, unplugging his toolkit and motioning for the team to move. "Let's leave them with a parting gift and make our exit." They retraced their steps, the chaos they'd unleashed still echoing through the ship. Freed creatures continued their rampage, adding to the confusion and buying the team precious moments. They reached the airlock, their tethered lifeline back to the rust bucket still intact. The storm outside showed no signs of abating, its fury both a hindrance and a shield. As they cycled through the airlock, the familiar confines of their ship welcomed them back. Ticho allowed himself a moment of relief, savoring the small victory they'd pulled from the jaws of certain disaster. Back in the command center, the team was met with a chorus of cheers and relieved smiles. They'd bought themselves time, a chance to regroup and plan their next move against an enemy that was far from defeated. "We did it," Ticho said, his voice carrying the weight of their shared triumph. "We hit them where it hurts and we lived to tell the tale. And gave them a little taste of Earth while we were at it," Lyra added, a satisfied smirk on her face. "Hope they like tornadoes." The room buzzed with a renewed sense of hope, tempered by the knowledge that their fight was far from over. But for now, they'd shown the Vextrons that humanity wouldn't go quietly into the night. As the team dispersed to tend to their duties, Ticho found himself once again at the viewport, watching the storm continue its relentless assault on Mars. They weren't out of danger yet, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like they had a fighting chance. Jax sidled up beside him, his usual sardonic grin in place. "Think they'll remember us now?" "Oh, they'll remember us all right," Ticho replied, a chuckle escaping his lips. "We're the unwanted guests that just won't leave." With that, they stood side by side, watching as the rust bucket held its course. A small, stubborn dot against the endless expanse of space, defying the odds and daring to hope. For in a universe that seemed determined to crush them, that defiance was the greatest victory of all. The rust bucket limped back toward the Martian colony, its hull-battered atmosphere systems wheezing like an asthmatic under siege. The crew, still riding the adrenaline high of their latest stunt, found themselves in a state of grim satisfaction. They'd poked the Vextrons in the eye and lived to tell the tale, which around these parts counted as a victory. Ticho Vorin stood in the command center, arms crossed, watching the holo-screens flicker with the chaotic aftermath of their escapade. Mars was a relentless, hostile bastard of a planet, its red dust storms a constant reminder of their precarious existence. But it was home, or as close to home as a rusting space hulk on a barren rock could be. Jax Harlan, his unofficial sparring partner in sarcasm, sauntered over, leaning against the same old console he'd made his second home. "So, boss," he began, fiddling with his notoriously unreliable sidearm, "think they'll throw us a parade? Or just pelt us with space debris for waking up Vextron HQ?" Ticho chuckled, though it was more of a dry rasp than a laugh. "If we're lucky, maybe both. At least space debris could be useful. We're running low on everything except bad luck." Lyra, who'd been monitoring the ship systems, piped up from her station. "Honestly, a parade might not be the worst idea. We could use the distraction from our impending doom." "Yeah, we'll call it Dancing in the Ashes Day," Jax quipped, not missing a beat. The rust bucket finally clanked into dock at the Martian colony, a sprawling complex of metal and grit that clung to the planet's surface like a barnacle on a whale. The airlock hissed open, and the crew was met with a blast of recycled air that carried the scent of desperation, a mix of sweat, metal, and the faintest hint of hope. As they disembarked, the colony's residents, those not too busy trying to keep the place from falling apart at the seams, gathered to greet them. The atmosphere was electric, a rare moment of triumph in a universe determined to crush them. "Well, look who decided to stroll back in one piece," said Riker, the burly head of the colony's maintenance team, his arms crossed over a chest broad enough to bench press a shuttle. "Thought the Vextrons might have had you for breakfast. Turns out they prefer their humans a bit more tenderized," Ticho replied, the corners of his mouth twitching upwards in a semblance of a smile. The crowd parted to let them through, their faces a mix of awe and gratitude, with a healthy sprinkle of skepticism. After all, living on Mars meant you always kept one eye on the sky and the other on your back. Once inside the main compound, the crew gathered in the communal mess hall, where the food was barely edible, and the coffee tasted like it had been brewed from the ashes of burnt dreams. But it was a place where they could catch their breath and take stock of their latest brush with death. Tarsa, ever the optimist, was the first to speak up. "We did good, didn't we? I mean, we actually made a difference." "Yeah," Jax said, twirling a spoon in a mug of something resembling coffee. "We're like a bad rash that just won't go away." "Persistence is an underrated quality," Ticho pointed out, though his eyes were heavy with exhaustion. As they sat there, the reality of their situation settled in. They'd managed to delay the Vextrons, but the bastards would be back, meaner and uglier than before. And when they came, the Rust Bucket and its ragtag crew would be right in the crosshairs. "At least we have a moment to breathe," Lyra said, trying to muster some enthusiasm. "Mars might be a dust ball, but it's our dust ball. And damn if we won't kick up a storm when they come knocking again," Jax added, raising his mug in a mock toast. Over the next few days, the colony buzzed with activity as repairs and preparations got underway. There was a renewed sense of purpose, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, they weren't completely screwed. Even if the odds were stacked higher than Mars' tallest dune, they had something the Vextrons didn't: a stubborn refusal to give up. Ticho found himself once again at the center of it all, coordinating efforts and trying to keep morale from nosediving into a pit of despair. It was a thankless job, but someone had to do it, and he'd be damned if he let the universe get the last laugh. As he moved through the colony, supervising repairs and offering what little encouragement he couldn't help but feel a grudging respect for his crew. They were a motley bunch, sure, but they had grit, and sometimes that was enough. "Hey, Ticho," Tarsa called out, jogging to catch up with him. Her face was smudged with grease, and she wore a grin that was as bright as the Martian sun was brutal. "The new comms array is up and running. We might actually be able to call for help if things go south. Or at least order a last meal," Ticho replied, unable to resist a dark joke even in the face of good news. "Thanks, Tarsa. You're a lifesaver." She beamed at him, and he was reminded that beneath her relentless optimism lay a core of steel. It was a quality he'd come to rely on, whether he liked to admit it or not. As night fell over the colony, a relative concept on Mars, where the planet's rotation turned the sky from a pale pink to a smothering black, the crew gathered once more in the mess hall. Exhaustion had settled over them like a second skin, but there was a sense of camaraderie, born from shared trials and the promise of more to come. "So, Ticho," Jax began, leaning back in his chair with the air of a man about to deliver a punchline. "What's the plan now? We gonna build a giant welcome mat for the Vextrons? Maybe one with some strategically placed landmines?" Ticho snorted, shaking his head. "Something like that. Right now we consolidate, repair, and prepare. We know they're coming back, and this time they'll be bringing more than just a zoo." "Good thing we're a resourceful bunch," Lyra said, twirling a fork in what passed for dinner. "If we can't beat them with brute force, we'll just have to outsmart them. And pray they don't have a backup plan that involves turning us into intergalactic roadkill," Jax added. The group fell silent for a moment, each lost in their own thoughts. The future was uncertain, but then again it always had been. Living on Mars was a constant battle against the elements, the universe, and sometimes even each other. But for all its hardships, it was their fight, and they wouldn't trade it for anything. "To Mars," Ticho said finally, raising a glass and being careful not to spill any of the precious liquid. "Our dust ball, our home. May we always have the strength to defend it and the wit to outfox those who would take it from us." The crew echoed his toast, their voices a rough harmony of determination and defiance. They were a small dot in a vast universe, but they were here, and they weren't going anywhere without a hell of a fight. As they settled into the uneasy routine of survival, Ticho found himself at the viewport once more, staring out at the unforgiving landscape. Mars was a harsh mistress, but it was theirs, and in the grand scheme of things, that meant more than any victory or defeat. Jax joined him, leaning on the frame with the ease of someone who'd seen too much but still had a few tricks up his sleeve. "Think we'll ever catch a break?" he asked, his voice a mix of sarcasm and genuine curiosity. Ticho considered the question, watching as the red dust swirled in the dying light. "Probably not," he admitted. "But when has that ever stopped us?" They stood there in silence, two figures against the backdrop of a planet that was as unforgiving as it was beautiful. In that moment they understood, if not the universe's relentless cruelty, then at least their place within it. They were the scratch in the record, the stubborn glitch in an otherwise perfect system. And as long as the rust bucket held together, they'd keep fighting, keep pushing back against the darkness that threatened to swallow them whole. Because in the end, that was what it meant to be human. To laugh in the face of oblivion and dare the universe to do its worst. And maybe, just maybe, come out the other side with a story worth telling. As the night descended and the Martian winds howled, Ticho and Jax turned away from the viewport, ready to face whatever came next. For now they had each other, a crew that was as resilient as it was irreverent. And in a universe determined to see them fail, that was more than enough.